It's almost 50 years since the Whiskey A Go-Go nightclub firebombing in Fortitude Valley. In 1973, 15 people lost their lives in the fire. Now, 23 pages containing criticism of police investigation into the fatal Brisbane nightclub firebombing have been made public for the first time. The pages removed in 2020 by a Queensland police officer under orders from her superior, Detective Inspector Damien Hanson. Now, ahead of an inquest into that fire, Detective Sergeant Virginia Gray prepared a formal report for the coroner, but was told by Inspector Hanson, her superior officer, to remove a section. Sergeant Gray says Inspector Hanson told her, quote, that sort of material should not be included in a report from the police, and that we would leave that to the journalists and police haters. Terry Goldsworthy is a criminologist at Bond University and a former detective, and he's on the line now. Terry, thanks for being on 4BC Drive.
Yeah, good afternoon, Scott.
As I said, almost 50 years since Whiskey A Go-Go, the firebombing, it's still making headlines. Now, how significant is this information that's been released today about criticism of the police investigation and also potentially that there were more people involved in the fire that weren't investigated?
Well, I think the really concerning thing here is, yes, you have two aspects as you outlined. One is potentially other suspects, which has been swirling around since Finch was making these claims years and years ago. But I think the thing that really concerns me is that in the present day, we still have senior police trying to exert this authority over in terms of editing and controlling the release of information by junior officers. That report should never have been edited. There should have been no pressure put on that officer to doctor or to amend her report to a form that satisfied a senior officer. The way these things work, if the junior officer puts that report up and that senior officer disagrees with some of the findings of it, well, they can put a covering report on that to outline why they disagree with those sections of the report. It's not the case you go back to the officer and say, remove those sections in their entirety. And the other issue I have is that there was some claim made, allegedly, that this was at the behest of the coroner, and he has subsequently denied that. So I really think this is something that the ethical standards should be looking at and investigating. I think it's very important in terms of transparency and good governance.
As you say, this is in 2020. This is not talking about what actually happened in 1973. This is a report prepared, as I say, almost 50 years after the event. Would there be any justification you can see for those parts of the report being removed just because there may be criticism of police actions in 1973?
No, none whatsoever. This is what these reports are about. But you go back and do an investigative review, it's highly likely you're going to find parts of the investigation that could have been done better. The report by its nature may well be critical. So if suddenly you're removing any of that criticism, then one would wonder, what is the point of doing an investigative review of the original investigation processes? It just defeats the logic of it. It almost goes back to, you're talking about the Whiskey Go, then you have senior police telling other police what to do. It starts to hark back to, the pre-Fitzgerald days. This kind of behaviour just shouldn't be tolerated, and I'd be interested to see what the police response is in regards to the fact that this officer was pressured to amend her report to make it more acceptable to senior officers.
Well, let's go back to the police investigation into 1973. Obviously, we do know that Finch and Stewart were both convicted of the firebombing, but the implication here is that police didn't do a thorough enough job in terms of the investigation, and potentially there were people involved in the firebombing that weren't pursued by the police at the time.
Well, that's correct, and those are quite significant criticisms to make. Any investigation of a major crime, you don't want police engaging what we call tunnel vision and being biased in terms of who the suspect should be, and then you get like a case construction where the case is made to fit those particular suspects. So if that's, may have occurred or suspected of being an issue, then there needs to be a full examination of the investigative process, and you don't achieve that by telling the person conducting it to, delete 26, 27 pages out of their report because they're too critical. That is the point of the report she is doing. So I say kudos to her for, persisting with that original report. There would have been immense pressure on her in terms of her giving into those demands, and they're concerning demands.
Going back to 73, do you think there's any possibility of that investigation now uncovering other people that may have been involved, being behind the firebombing?
Look, it's going to be difficult. I mean, it's almost 50 years has passed, but I mean, given the significance of the event, the amount of harm inflicted in terms of people who were killed, etc., I think the relatives have a right to every stone being turned over to see what the answers are. And if there are other suspects who weren't followed up, they should be followed up now. I mean, there's no statute of limitation on these types of issues, so I think the full resources of the QPS should be put into place to make sure that everyone is satisfied that the proper and thorough investigation was conducted. And, the issues raised in that 27 pages should be addressed appropriately. That would have been the proper response to address those criticisms and accept them and move on from there, not to try and hide them.
Terry Goldsworthy, thanks for being on the show today.
Thanks, Scott.
Lost in the Sahara Desert, Lars has a craving.
Water!
Thanks to Salesforce Customer 360, the teams at Hydration Nation come to the rescue. The marketing team offers him a selection.
Bubbly?
And the service team suggests an upgrade.
Oh, raspberry.
With Salesforce Customer 360, all your teams unite around Lars to make him a happy, hydrated customer. Learn how to succeed from anywhere at salesforce.com/au/360.